A moment later, one of the hotel staff brought in a bloody platter of filet mignon, a bottle of Chardonnay, and three lovely young women. The women were perfect specimens. As Mr. Moore's eyes traced the shapes of their bodies, the curves all behaved exactly as he hoped. Function followed form, and the women glided into the room with effortless grace. Their manners showed the utmost refinement. Mr. Moore was pleasantly surprised by the blonde's stunning white dress. After the three women were seated, dinner and wine were served. Conversation was lively, which meant that the women enjoyed listening to Mr. Moore talk about himself. He spoke passionately about his ideal of beauty, of which he assured them they were prime examples. The women all laughed excessively at the clever composition of his witticisms. How did Mr. Moore do it? Were there limits to Mr. Moore's brilliance? He was happy to prove to them, time after time, that in fact there were not. As the night went on, the women fawned over him ever more enthusiastically. He caught and returned their flirtatious stares more and more often. He knew where the night was going. Then, perhaps due to the effects of the wine, Mr. Moore made his only mistake of the night. As he was delivering the punchline to a story about an ironic incident at the Louvre, he slapped the blonde on the shoulder. It wasn't so hard that it should have been painful, but it was more forceful than intended, more like the hearty clap of a friend than the delicate touch of a lover. A sound was heard like the tearing of paper, and a wine glass shattered on the table. Mr. Moore's shapely jaw dropped. Flat on the table, literally flat on the table, lay the blonde's arm, torn off at the shoulder, now clutching the broken remains of a glass. Mr. Moore sat dumbfounded. "Now why did you have to go and do that? We were having such a nice night." She casually picked up her own paper-thin arm, and it billowed and hung lifeless in the air. "They'll have to reprint me now, you know. My night is completely spoiled." Mr. Moore looked at his wineglass and stood up, backing away from the table in horror. "Reprint you?" "Yes, of course, Mr. Moore," replied the blonde. As she turned to giggle with the other women, her head became thinner and then disappeared. Looking at all of the women now, Mr. Moore realized that they were all no thicker than poster board. It was as if he was watching three cardboard cutouts come to life. How had he not noticed before? Terror-stricken, Mr. Moore backed farther away. "He's not really so brilliant after all," chimed in the brunette. "What, Mr. Moore? Did you expect 3 dimensions? You only paid for 2. 3 is more than you can afford." The women all laughed again. In his distraction, he backed into the beautiful glass sculpture and knocked it over. Instead of shattering, it just fell flat on the floor, stiff and thin. Mr. Moore was in a panic now. He stumbled around the room, and everything he bumped into fell rigidly to the floor, two-dimensional. The grand piano tipped over like a domino into the fine couch, which in turn knocked over a coffee table. The entire fireplace stopped crackling and came unpasted from the wall. Mr. Moore backed against the enormous window that was the outer wall, but nearly lost his balance when the entire thing fell out of the building, taking with it the picturesque cityscape. Where there was a window a moment before, there was now only black nothingness, and Mr. Moore stood on the precipice. Regaining his balance, he ran toward the interior of the building. He reached the door of the suite none too soon, for the missing wall had destabilized the ceiling, and it was now falling in one flat piece to the floor. The whole room was collapsing, like a house of cards. By the time Mr. Moore reached the hallway outside his suite, he could feel the whole structure swaying, as if its walls might topple at any moment. Mr. Moore ran. He didn't know where he was running to, but terror spurred him on. He ran down the opulent hallway as fast as he could. Behind him, chandeliers, sculptures, and entire walls and ceilings fell with a thud as the building shook. He spotted a man on the other end of the long hall sprinting towards him. Why would this man be running toward the destruction? A strange feeling of déjà vu possessed Mr. Moore. Then he recognized it. It was the same hideous creature from the hillside. It was running at him with all the speed it could muster. They were going to collide. Mr. Moore decided he would run right through the monster. It seemed to be as frail as it was disgusting. He lowered his shoulder and charged. He felt the collision like a brick wall. The creature couldn't possibly have been that strong, could it? Mr. Moore, who had been laid flat on his back, struggled to his feet. The thing was on its feet too, but it looked more pathetic than ever. "Out of my way!" yelled Mr. Moore, and he moved to pass the creature on the right. But it moved just as quickly to its left, blocking his way. The thing just stood there, chest heaving, staring at Mr. Moore with its one good eye. It was as scared as he was. For the first time, Mr. Moore felt pity for the creature. "What do you want from me?" Mr. Moore threw up his hands in desperation, and then he froze. The creature had made exactly the same motion with its hands at exactly the same time. It couldn't be. He moved again, and the creature mimicked him exactly. Then he looked down and saw his own blistered hands and felt his own disfigured face. His fine clothes were nothing but rags torn by his misshapen body. Mr. Moore collapsed in front of the mirror and cried there on the floor. He could feel the building falling in on itself. The floor fell from beneath him, and he felt a sensation of vertigo. "Mr. Moore? Hey there. You gave us a heck of a scare, but you're gonna be all right. You overdosed." Mr. Moore's eyes worked to focus on the woman standing above him. He had the worst headache of his life. It was a middle-aged woman dressed in white, a nurse, and he was in a hospital bed. He looked the woman over carefully. Her legs were a tad too short, her eyes were too far apart, and her face was etched with worry lines. He had never seen a more beautiful woman in his life. Just to be sure, he pointed across the room and watched as she turned to follow his hand. Sure enough, she was three-dimensional. "Thank you," he told her, and he took a deep breath. Mr. Moore never thought he would be so happy to hear the din of the hospital and smell its faint blend of chemical cleaner, vomit, and excrement. The bland and sterile appearance of his room didn't bother him in the least. He grabbed a hand mirror from his bedside and examined himself. At the moment, his hair was a mess, and his face looked sickly and pale, but he was still his handsome self. He did, however, notice several imperfections he hadn't before. His nose was slightly asymmetrical. His forehead was too big. Was that a gray hair? It didn't upset him. In fact, he thought, it added a new dimension to the composition. He looked out his window into a brilliant blue sky and felt his heart skip a beat. But then he saw that the clouds were moving, and the leaves of a tree outside his window were dancing in the breeze.